A very good evening to everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture, Haunted Images, the War Art of Laura Knight and Peter Howson, which wonderfully ties together our current exhibition showcasing Peter Howson's Holocaust Crowd Scene 2, which finishes this Friday, so please don't miss it, and our next exhibition, which will explore Laura Knight's major studies for her painting at the Imperial War Museum on the Nuremberg trial. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, just to remind you please to remain mute and to turn your camera off during the lecture to lessen any possible interference. But do please type any questions into the chat and I'll endeavour to read out as many as possible at the end. We may go over a little over our usual 45 minutes tonight, but we will wrap everything up by 7:45 so that our speaker doesn't get locked inside the Imperial War Museum, which, although I'm sure it would be fascinating, I think she would be missed by her family. So I'm really delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Claire Brennard, who's a longtime friend of the gallery. Claire has been an art curator at the Imperial War Museum since 2012. She's currently writing a book, Visions of War, Art of the Imperial War Museum, which is a guide to the museum's art collection and features over 150 different artists and their works, including, I'm glad to say, Peter Howson and Laura Knight. And that's due to be published in November this year, and it's eagerly awaited, I must say. Claire's role at the museum is broad and varied. It involves research into existing collections and curating art exhibitions, including wartime London Art of the Blitz at the Churchill War Rooms and assisting on the exhibition Age of Terror, Art Since 9/11. And so without further ado, over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Sarah. All right, I will just go and do my sharing of the screen. Here we go. So hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so hello and thank you so much for inviting me. It's always good to work with Ben Ury, and of course there are significant overlaps between what we do in our respective institutions. And I have to say, I was eyeing that wonderful watercolour by Joseph Herman at Rosebery's auction house, and I'm absolutely delighted that it went to the Ben Ury collection. Just mentioned that to Sarah just now. So on to Laura Knight and Peter Howson. Now, of course, they're not obvious artists to examine together, but what they do both have in common is they can be described as war artists, in the sense they both received commissions from British institutions to make artworks about live or recent conflicts. Howson was commissioned by the Imperial War Museum in 1993, while for the Nuremberg works, Knight was commissioned in late 1945 by the War Artists Advisory Committee, which came under the British government's Ministry of Information. And it's no exaggeration to say that both the assignments were the defining moments in their respective careers and in their lives. What they'd witnessed in the course of these commissions left indelible impressions on these artists, who then created artworks that were infused, haunted if you like, with the disturbing imagery that they had witnessed. So at first I thought I'd take a look at the kind of work they were doing immediately before their momentous assignments. And this brought about this extraordinary juxtaposition of this slide. I think gender studies specialists would have a field day on this. I should say also all images in this talk are from the IWM collection, unless it says otherwise. Both artists' work here presents us with gender stereotypes. There's something of the personalities and personal preoccupations comes to the fore also. Knight's painting of Ruby Loftus presents us with an exceptional woman who nonetheless is unthreatening and conforms to the feminine ideal. And Howson, on the other hand, is preoccupied with the problematic and highly threatening aspects of masculinity. And both artists at this stage were already well known, but Laura Knight was really at the height of her fame. In fact, she was the most famous female artist in Britain. In her 1965 memoir, Magic of a Line, she acknowledges this position, saying, and I quote, "Even today, a female artist is considered more or less a freak and may either be undervalued or overpraised, and by sole virtue of her rarity and her sex, be of better press value," end quote. And I think she did know how to make the most of her position, her rather unique position. She had been the first woman artist to be made a Dane in 1929 and the first woman to be elected to the Royal Academy since 1768. Peter Howson had gained a lot of attention with his violent, muscular work and already had a successful career and a celebrity following. So, looking at Knight's commission first. In 1945, Laura Knight was already a war artist. Since 1940, she received a series of mostly portrait commissions from the War Artists Advisory Committee. Now, a bit about the War Artists Advisory Committee, which was the brainchild of Kenneth Clark. He was the director of the National Gallery and an influential art historian and patron. And he helped to establish this committee in November 1939, right at the beginning of the Second World War. He took inspiration from the British war artist schemes of the First World War, which had commissioned, among others, but famously Paul Nash, John Singer Sargent, C.R.W. Nevinson, Stanley Spencer. And like in the previous war, this artist commissioning body came under the Ministry of Information. And this is the British government department responsible for all forms of propaganda and censorship across all media. It's including films, newspaper, radio, posters, photojournalism, advertising, even comics. In the context of all of this, collecting war art was a rather niche activity within the ministry. Part of Clark's motivation was to help sustain artists during wartime, giving them opportunities to work and keeping them away from the front line. He also thought that the state should have a role in supporting artists. Now, although the word was felt to be rather distasteful, art did have a role as propaganda. And this painting by Knight is one of the most overt examples. Knight was approached by the committee to paint Ruby Loftus, a 21-year-old who had mastered the difficult technical task of making a breech ring for a Bofors gun. Apparently, this normally would have taken about 8 or 9 years to master this difficult task. And so much was made of the story, and Loftus became the poster girl for women working in the factories during the war. Literally, colour reproductions of Knight's painting were made for distribution to factory canteens, and we actually have a bit of newsreel in the IWM archive of Loftus and Knight visiting the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition in 1943. And it's captioned, Royal Ordnance Factory Girls Portrait, its picture of the year. So it made a big splash at the time. And Knight's portrayal of Loftus showed us as an exceptional woman, as I mentioned, who retained feminine qualities and exuded a kind of easy glamour despite mastering this difficult masculine task. The painting shows Knight's rigorous approach to realism, and she had visited this factory in Newport to observe all the details of the machinery, and so it became one of the most famous paintings of the war. And so, come 1945, the war in Europe was ending. During this time, liberating armies were brought into direct contact with the remnants of the Nazi concentration camp system as they closed in on Germany. Now, this happened most famously at Belsen, liberated by the British Army, which was overcrowded with prisoners who had been forced there from other camps. The Allies gathered plenty of evidence of the genocidal campaign against Europe's Jewish and Roma people for groundbreaking trials. First, the Belsen British Military Tribunal in September 1945, and then at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg from November 1945 until October 1946. where 22 leading Nazis were tried. It was the first time that international leaders had attempted to put another nation on trial for war crimes. Nuremberg was chosen for its symbolic significance, having been the site of Nazi rallies. It was Knight's idea to tackle the Nuremberg trial, and she writes to the committee in December 1945, "Dear Mr. Gregory, what about the trial at Nuremberg for a subject instead of tanks?" Doesn't sound as interesting, does it? It seems a pity for such an event to be unrecorded, and I feel that artistically it should prove exciting. I believe that a gallery runs round the hall where the press are. That would probably be all right for me. I realise that the work would have to be done from small drawings held on one's knee. This I am quite used to doing for certain types of subject." End quote. After about a week, the committee agreed, and Knight becomes the second woman after Mary Kessel, who they commissioned to travel abroad. Both of these women were commissioned after the war was over. She becomes a war correspondent at Nuremberg, and it was the first time at the age of 68 that she had travelled by air. Knight describes her first impressions of Nuremberg in her 1965 memoir, The Magic of a Line. I quote, "Our VIP plane arrived at Fürth, and on our way to the Grand Hotel at Nuremberg, we got our first view of the horror of total destruction. This, the unique relic of antiquity in Europe, was a rubble heap. The Grand Hotel itself," this is where Knight was staying, about 3 miles from Fürth, was the only building still retaining some of its original architectural features. Much of its centre had been injured. Had I come a week earlier, I was told, I would have had to walk a plank to get from the stairs to my suite. A lot of the walling has gone, and all that could be seen of what has been the municipal buildings opposite were fragments of stone and brick topped with a few black rafters." End quote. So when she goes to the courtroom, which was the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, it seems that the sense of order that fostered there was in complete contrast with the destruction outside, and there was high security, bag checks, solemn atmosphere of the courtroom. And there were a number of other artists there, including Joseph Flatter, David Lowe, Felix Topolsky, Eric Taylor. And this image here by Julius Stafford Baker, we can see the opposite view to what she would have seen. And her, I don't know if you can see, can I do a laser pointer? There we go. So this is the window where Knight would have been looking down on the defendants here, the judges here. So we get an idea of, she had this high viewpoint. Let's take that off. So yes, that room there was used by an American broadcasting company. And so she was able to draw on the spot there. And she also had an office which she would use as a painting studio. So here are some examples of the preparatory drawings that the War Artists Advisory Committee also acquired. You can see that view down into the courtroom that she had. And she described it as being very cold. It was winter when she was there. She was sitting wrapped up in a blanket and her fur coat. In her Nuremberg diary, she also talks about her coping mechanisms. I quote, "Most of today, I keep my window closed, shutting out the happenings of the court. Often its horror is beyond bearing. I shut it out and concentrate on my composition." She also falls asleep after lunch. In fact, in February 1946, Knight heads home to England for a week's rest. She wrote, "The horrors have got me down." She does not go into detail about the personal effect on her. There's a telling line where she says, "Even swallowing a mouthful of food is difficult." But valiantly, she returns to Nuremberg to complete the task, working in the office studio mostly this time, and lunching with the VIPs to get the gossip. So this is Knight's painting which was finally submitted to the committee in April 1946. It's an incredible creative response for an artist who was known for her strict approach to realism. Indeed, most of the canvas replicates her view from her high-up window, made by squaring up her drawings done there to translate onto canvas. She thought carefully about where all the defendants would go, was not afraid to move them around in order to suit the composition. But of course, the most remarkable element is along the top and the top left of the painting, where she has overlaid a backdrop of Germany's still burning ruins. And it made such an impression on her. This treatment is a departure for Knight, and I've not seen her do anything like this before or since. In her notes on the painting, she commented, I quote, "In that ruined city, death and destruction are ever present. They had come into the picture. Without them, it would not have been Nuremberg as it now is during the trial, when the death of millions and the utter devastation are the sole topic of conversation wherever one goes, whatever one is doing." In her memoir, she wrote, "I knew the meaning of total destruction on the first day after I arrived, when he had taken me to see this destruction, the devastation. I remember coming across a man, one of the few survivors in the city, who told us 1,000 British bombers were dropping hell all night. Bombs fell like rain. Only a few of us who found deep shelters to creep into were left alive. While night was there, the temperature was freezing, and people were living outside among the rubble, living off scraps of food." And even as early as 1946, the tensions of the Cold War were beginning to emerge. Now that Germany had been defeated, the differences between the Soviet Union and its Western allies were coming out even in the trial, as each nation took a different tack in its prosecution. So, quickly whizzing through the whole period, missing out really the whole period of the Cold War, and fast forward to the early 90s and the end of that war to talk about Howson's commission. In 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia too was breaking apart. Firstly, two of its constituent republics broke away, ushering in two wars, one brief, bringing Slovenia's independence, and one between the Serb-dominated Yugoslav state and Croatia, lasting until 1995. But much of the worst violence resulted from the complex struggle over the fate of a third republic, Muslim-majority Bosnia. In 1992, British troops arrived in the region as part of a UN protection force in response to the vicious fighting in Bosnia's war fought between Serbs, Croats, and Bosnian Muslims. The conflict was widely reported in the news in Britain, particularly its campaigns of so-called ethnic cleansing. In the early 1990s, Peter Howson's body of work at this time focused on these rather grotesque depictions of masculinity, hard men and hooligans, in this case, the violent gangs of men in Glasgow. Howson had long been fascinated with such themes, drawing battle scenes since he was a boy. His intention was never to glorify violence, which he detested, but he believed we all have the capacity for it within ourselves. Growing up, he was a loner. He preferred to stay inside drawing. He was bullied at school, and his temperament was the very opposite of the threatening figures he portrayed. In his work, the 18th century Spanish painter Francisco Goya, who famously depicted the disasters of war, was a strong influence on Howson. He was an artist primed to tackle the brutal business of war. Howson was already on the radar of the IWM at this time. In 1990, it purchased this study, bottom right, for the regimental bath. The final painting is in the City Art Centre in Edinburgh. This was a controversial depiction of the British Army, and it reflected Howson's time as a member of a Scottish infantry unit. Howson remembers the soldiers picking on a new, weaker member of the unit and subjecting him to bullying and abuse, as shown here, was one of the punishments for somebody considered unhygienic, dirty, smelly. It was something done to outsiders. This experience left a strong impression on Howson. He was ashamed that he was a passive bystander in this, and he was in the army for less than a year. This drawing was rather controversial to show at the museum, and Angela Waite, who was Keeper of Art at the time, has told me that the Director General of the time, Alan Borg, instructed her to take it off display. But it was in early 1993, Howson was facing a creative block, struggling to put together his latest show at Flowers Gallery in East London. And it was around this time that the Times newspaper approached the Imperial War Museum with a proposal to collaborate in sending an artist to Bosnia. Now, at this point, IWM did have a history of commissioning war artists. And that started in 1972, when it sent Ken Howard to Northern Ireland. Although it had modelled this commissioning on Clark's War Artists Advisory Committee in the Second World War, it was very different. For one thing, Britain was no longer in what we call total war, i.e. the whole country on a war footing, as it had been in the Second World War. Also, IWM did not have the capacity to engage as many artists as its predecessor, which had collected around 6,000 works by 400 artists by the end of the Second World War. In contrast, IWM Artistic Records Committee, as it was called, engaged on average around 1 or 2 artists a year. The museum, which always had rather limited funds for art commissioners, decided that a collaboration with the Times would be beneficial. So together, both organisations considered a short list of 9 artists, finally settling on Peter Howson for the job. Howson, like Knight, was determined to do the commission. He felt it would unlock his creative block. He also felt instinctively that it was his fate to go to Bosnia. It would prove a turning point in not only his career, but his life. Unlike Knight, of course, he was entering an active war zone, but he was excited about the prospect. This feeling disappeared, however, the moment he stepped off the plane in June 1993, and he became extremely fearful, understandably. And added into this mix, he was shadowed by a BBC film crew who were filming him for their 40-minute series. There was a lot of media attention on him in general, and all his reactions would be recorded and judged in real time. After a short period of acclimatization in the Croatian coastal town of Split, Howson headed into central Bosnia with the British Army. This painting captures the kind of winding, mountainous roads that were the only passage into Bosnia. Their convoy was forced to follow around 30 to 40 UN aid lorries around these sharp, twisting roads. And it was here that Howson had witnessed a lorry skid and turn over. The crew had no choice but to wait alone with their consignment until help came. In this painting, he shows the convoy heading for Gornji Vakuf, where there was a large camp for British soldiers. They had been briefed on the danger surrounding them. Muslim bandits had recently attacked and killed Italian aid workers, and those who had escaped were deeply traumatized. The painting reflects the sense of foreboding as the convoy, accompanied by an armored car, journeys through this very dangerous territory. Along the way, passing through Prozor, Howson described the unmistakable smell, I'm quoting here, of blood and death hanging over the place. He saw unaccompanied children, and I quote, "As we passed, they waved at us almost mechanically, pointing at their open mouths to show that they needed food. There were some adults there too, but they didn't acknowledge us and their eyes were blank. They looked right through us as if we didn't exist. To me, it was as if there was a curse on the place. It was like something from a fairy tale, a town that had been cast into darkness at the whim of a vengeful god." Now, this reminded me of something actually. I've heard similar description used by the artist Rosalind Nashashibi, who was commissioned by the IWM to go to Gaza in 2014. She felt that the place was under a spell and it was like a kind of alternative universe, and trying to convey this in her film Electrical Gaza that was commissioned by the museum. But getting back to this slide, this painting, Plum Grove, was bought by the Tate Collection following Howson's exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in 1994. It was actually the first work by the artist that the gallery had bought. While Howson could stay in the camp with the British Army, the TV crew could not. And they stayed with a Croatian family who were renting their house. And Howson also decided to join them there, and he felt he could find a bit of normality, albeit, family life with gunfire in the distance. At the same time, he was under the glare of the TV cameras who were filming his reactions, for example, to seeing his first corpse. And added to that, Scottish tabloid The Daily Record reported that he had sensationally quit after just 4 days. This wasn't true, and later an apology would be printed. But the damage was done. Back home, Howson's family home was besieged by journalists. In the end, his trip was cut short, not that short, but it was cut short, because he caught dysentery and eventually transferred home. Understandably, Howson had been very frightened, but he had fought his fears until the illness took him. However, unsympathetic tabloid media characterized him as a coward. This was a real low point for the artist when he returned home. He could not even paint. His creative block was worse, if anything. He could not process at this point what he had seen. But eventually, he decided he needed to return to Bosnia and suggested the idea to the Imperial War Museum, who agreed it was a good idea. And 6 months later, and this time in December 1993, he headed out again to the conflict zone. There were some changes. He was given an honorary rank of major and uniform, so he'd be better treated by the army, who weren't particularly sympathetic to him. They didn't really understand what he was all about. And he brought along an assistant as well, Ian McCall, who was he's a Glaswegian sculptor, and a very jovial presence. He's quite different in demeanour to Howson, and together they made a strong team, and much more at ease. His working methods, well, he used video, which McCall was filming. Howson commented, "You can't sketch someone who is utterly terrified." They spent their days accompanying the army on their business and worked in the evenings. And it was no less grueling than before. They were shot at by snipers and attacked by young men using hypodermic needles as blow darts. But they also got involved. Howson described what he called a watershed moment when he and McCall helped the British Army collect around 150 deeply traumatized, some of them had been raped, women and children who had been made homeless by the Serbs when they'd driven them out of the Muslim town of Banja Luka. This was a breakthrough for Howson, as he could finally help rather than be a detached observer, something he'd long been uncomfortable with. And Howson's always been very honest about his experience. He says that helping these traumatized people was a breakthrough for him personally. Howson returned from his second trip, and this time he began to paint. He found painting the horrors therapeutic. By the summer of 1994, he had an impressive body of work to show IWM's Artistic Records Committee. They, and I quote from the minutes, agreed that the images were very powerful. Some were most upsetting, and all portrayed the horrific nature of the conflict in Bosnia. It was established that some images depicted events which the artist had himself witnessed. Others were compositions based upon a combination of experiences and reports from army contacts. And then this is the painting on the slide here that they selected for the permanent collection. It shows a vulnerable family group of Bosnian Muslim refugees whom Howson had witnessed. They were refused entry to the UN camp where he was, and Howson remembered their desperation as they were exposed to sniper fire. A British soldier had urged him to draw them, but he could not. In the end, the peacekeepers advised the refugees to seek shelter amongst a convoy of tanks, which they did. But seeing them, and that image was burned deeply into his mind, he came up with this painting. Howson's show opened in September 1994 at the Imperial War Museum and Flowers East Gallery concurrently, and there were 35 paintings to show. But of those paintings, it was not this one, but another one which became notorious, attracting a lot of attention and debate. It still does. And the reason was because it wasn't chosen for IWM's collection. Talking about Howson's depiction of a violent rape scene, it's called Croatian and Muslim. Howson had based the imagery on numerous witness accounts. The committee's vote had been close, with the two women members, so the keeper of art Angela Waite and art critic Marina Vasey, in favour of its acquisition, but they were outvoted. The stumbling block was that the artist had not personally witnessed the scene, and that therefore the work could not be included in an artistic records committee acquisition. And this was the strong view of IWM's Director General at the time, Alan Borg. The painting's subject matter, that of rape, had long been a weapon of war, but one that was still largely a taboo subject, or at least only associated with brutal conflicts of the distant past, not modern Europe. However, reports of the Bosnian conflict brought the scale of its sexual violence to the attention of a shocked public. In the view of the Times leader from September 1994, Croatian and Muslim was, I quote, terrifying in its art and in its impact, and according to many, the most specific symbol of a savage racial war in which rape and the rumours of rape have played so dominant a part. But the newspaper did have some sympathy with the IWM's decision, and it decided not to publish an image of the painting itself. By the end of the decade, the Museums Committee would evolve into the Art Commissions Committee. That's what it's called today. And this removed the stress on this rather outdated idea of artistic records and freed up artists. Now the emphasis was on their creative responses to conflict in their commissions. I think this is a subject for a whole other talk, by the way. The debate Howson's work provoked in the press about the merits of imaginative painting in the field of war art has proved to be an enduring one. Most recently, the painting Croatian and Muslim appeared in Mary Beard's series on forbidden art for BBC Two just last year. Famously, the painting at the time was bought by pop star David Bowie, who wished to save it from being sold to someone in the US. As for Howson, making paintings about the Bosnian War had proved cathartic. The nightmares he had long suffered throughout his Bosnian experience had finally ended. So I thought I'd bring the Ben Uri works into this here. Howson, as we know, went on, he continues to be a completely prolific artist and continues to be unafraid to tackle humanity at its most violent, extreme, and debased. His experiences as a war artist in Bosnia had given him further insight into the subject that preoccupied him, looking unflinchingly at the enduring theme of the human condition. Night, on the other hand, returned to her previous themes, ballet, circus, gypsies. Above all, she was continuing to look for interesting subjects, interesting people to make real in paint. Her attitude to life was to live in the present, so the war years were the exception for her. Her can-do nature meant that she had embraced the opportunities that came her way. Her themes were not like Howson's. She was interested in documenting interesting humans as she observed them, recreating them on the page. And the drawings Ben-Uri have acquired give us an insight into her working practice as she temporarily pivoted away from her usual subject matter in order to engage with and record such an important historical event. I've just shown one of them here with a detail of the Howson painting that Ben-Uri have acquired. These were exceptional periods for both artists, and they show them for the individuals they are. Both have a determination to be part of something momentous. Night, who was a trailblazer, a woman marking out her space and doing it her way in a man's world. She also notably took control of her assignment, and after all, it was her idea. She decided when to take a break, who she talked to and engaged with, when to disengage, and when to finally leave for home. But in some ways, she was conventional. In her work, she kept to the conventions of the time, this kind of feeling of reserve. Her drawings are restrained. If she didn't look far beneath the surface, it's because her art is an intense study of surfaces, of faces, bodies, and their settings, allowing her, and therefore us, to deduce what she could from appearances alone. In the case of the wider setting of Nuremberg, its appearance betrayed its undeniable truth to her. Howson, in contrast, was initially out of control and arguably out of his depth when it came to his commission, but he managed to regain control on his second trip. He'd always confronted in his work masculinity at its most toxic and problematic. At the same time, he was not immune to the expectations associated with his gender. When he was framed as a coward, it affected him deeply. When he was able to upend this, prove himself, he had his personal and artistic breakthrough. The Howson too is a product of his time, when there was a place for an artist like him to smash taboos and show us his unrelenting and exhaustive examination of human nature at its most horrifying. Following his well-documented struggles with drink, drugs, his family breakdown, he has now found the Christian faith to sustain him, and it emerges in his work. He continues to confront humanity's worst excesses, what most of us would rather ignore. It is this inquiry which inevitably led him to the subject of the Holocaust. It could be said that these two artists show us two sides of the same coin, the brutality and chaos of Howson's art and the rationality and scrutiny of Knight's vision. These artists show us contradictory but truthful insights into human nature and the human condition. Thank you, and I think possibly I've whizzed through that because it's a lot earlier than I thought, but that's the end of my talk, and there's lots of time for questions if you do have any. I will. So I stop sharing.
Thank you, Claire. That was really wonderful, absolutely fascinating, and beautifully brought together those two artists and their contrasting experience. Two artists that seemed perhaps disparate on the surface, but in fact, you really showed how much in a way they had in common, but also where they diversified. And I was very interested in what you said about the sort of gender studies aspect. And I wondered if you wanted to start by telling us a little bit more about that, perhaps. And I'll just be looking at the chat to see if our audience are limbering.
Yeah. Shall I bring up that slide again? Because I think it's just...
Yes, that would be...
where are we? Here we go. So I'll just... No. Sorry. Don't know what's happened here from the beginning, and then let's do it. Yes, this one, isn't it? Yes.
I don't think
So,
we're seeing that.
oh, you can't see it. You can't see it. Okay. Let me. That's crucial. Let's
Not
try
sure
again.
if that's been disabled, has it? If it has,
No, it hasn't. I think I'll just try again. I think because it.
okie
Yeah.
doke.
Share screen. Window. That one. Share. Okay. Does that work?
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah, you were talking about those, the intrinsic sort of gender values within that. Now, it would be lovely if you wanted to unpack that a little bit more.
yeah, I mean, if you take night at first, it's obviously very famously the Second World War is an interesting time for women as they're brought into the factories and they're having to sort of step into these into a man's world because they, to help the war effort, they just need to they're needed to do that. These young women, and the propaganda value of this image and the whole story behind it, because Ruby Loftus there's interviews with her in the press is much made about her, that she's this young woman, she's only 21, but she still, once this is all over, she wanted to settle down and have a family and go back into the home. So there's this idea that, yeah, it's okay, the women can come in and do these jobs, but the only understanding when everything goes back to normal, they go back into the home, they go back into their sphere and their areas. And the way Knight obviously has this approach to realism. She's gone and she's looked at, it's incredible the detail that you see in this painting, but isn't Loftus such a cool customer? She's looking very relaxed. She isn't, it's intense. She's intensely looking at what she's doing and she's working on this, but it doesn't look like the taxing job that apparently it was, because if there's any mistake made, that was potentially very dangerous for the weaponry that was being made, apparently. And then she's also put in the context of, you can see her fellow workers in the background, all the women who are much more sort of generic. We don't see their faces. So there's Brian Foss in his book about the War Artists Advisory Committee writes on this. It's really interesting what he says, because there's this idea of this Loftus as this exceptional woman, and this is mirrored in the story of Laura Knight, and she was an exceptional woman, and this is the woman that's being celebrated. Really, we're not talking about ordinary women, we're talking about exceptional women, and they're allowed to be celebrated. So it's just a fascinating painting, and I just think it's fascinating that that was the inspiration, that was printed and put in canteens, and these women were like, yes, you can aspire to this. So it's a hugely aspirational image, which is, you wouldn't say that the Howson image is not aspirational in the slightest. Yes.
If I can interrupt you rudely,
yes,
for
of course.
1 second, Claire. I was just really interested. I think in the talk you said that Ruby Loftus had mastered this task, which usually took about 9 years, just a couple of years. And so one wonders whether this remark that's printed about her wanting to give up afterwards and go back and raise a family is to sort of offset the remarkableness of her achievement, seeming to outshine her male colleagues at that point. But
yes, absolutely. I mean, that I've seen that sort of talked about before, and I've never had a chance to really dig into it and find out, why was it something that took so long? How did she get it so quickly? What was it about her? And I feel that's the problem with this sort of, we have a lot of information about this. In some ways it was widely reported on, but those deeper questions we don't have an answer to.
absolutely.
What the process was.
I've got two. One is a is a comment, and one is a question coming in here. Well, also an earlier comment to thank you for the fascinating information. Then a comment here from Colin Cohen, who says that the Ruby Loftus painting has the same dynamic as one of the cartoonist David Lowe's most famous drawings. And interestingly, I think David Lowe was one of the Nuremberg artists as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's an interesting comment.
And then we have a question from Tina Matania. Do you think particular artworks have informed and assisted the aim of achieving justice, prosecuting crimes against women in the context of war?
Oh goodness. Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? The whole story around Howson and that painting. I think we're a bit more open now. I mean, it's a horrific subject, this idea of sexual violence as a weapon of war, but I think it's something that's much more widely studied now. In fact, you know, we've been grappling for a while at IWM about doing what we call a season on this and really tackling this subject in our exhibitions. Whereas, you know, it wasn't that long ago, the early 90s, where, you know, obviously it's shocking, but it's shocking at any time, but it was far more taboo, you know, and we have this reasoning that it wasn't something he witnessed, but I'm not sure. I think there was another reason as well, that this wasn't the one we acquired. It's not really answering your question. I don't know whether, obviously everything that artists do in terms of making work about war and engaging with war and making us think of these huge questions is important. It allows us to search ourselves and all of that. But in terms of sort of justice and evidence, I think the only example I can think of, there's been times where artworks have been used as evidence, and we have those in the collection. So I'm thinking about the people who are prisoners of war in the Far East during the Second World War. So somewhere like that, where there wasn't much film footage or photographic footage, which are the sort of primary sort of mediums that we go to for visual evidence, you have the evidence of these artists. And I mean, there's people like Philip Meninsky were drawing sort of the sort of improvised medical operations and the diseases that were happening, and this is evidence. But yeah, that's a bit of a different thing in terms of, I think obviously what Howson was doing, he's the trailblazer. He's trying to confront these things first, that no one else is, you know, who would make a painting of that sort of thing. He's doing that, but it's a step along the way, I suppose, in this kind of, let's start to talk about this, let's start to think about this. Yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers.
No, thank you. The questions are all, and comments are all coming in thick and fast. Okay. We've obviously opened something up there. So David McAvoy thanks you for all that information again, and he wonders whether the IWM would be interested in purchasing similar paintings. I think you've sort of maybe covered that by what you went on to say. As he says, Howson's work moves beyond the artist as eyewitness, and even seems to move beyond the artist as a means for recording and imaginatively responding to the eyewitness accounts of others. Tina again enjoys the details of the Loftus painting. Our own David Glasser asks how much interaction there was between the Imperial War Museum employers and the artist as the employee before, during and after commissioning. And just hoping you're having time to absorb these.
We might have to go back on these, and I'll do them one by one.
Just notes that she had, or he, I'm not quite sure, this viewer had booked on to listen to Laura Knight, but is now knocked out by Howson, the rape picture in particular, having been appalled by the number of women being raped across Europe in conflicts. And then I think I don't know if you want to come back on any of that before. go
Yeah,
on.
yeah, I'm not going to take it all in. So about the contact with the artists. So IWM sort of commissioning has sort of been evolving ever since it started in 1972. And I think what came up with Howson's experience, and then after Howson, we sent the artist Graham Fagan to Kosovo. We really started to evolve our thinking, and Graham Fagan, he was the first artist. We do keep in contact with our artists, but he was the first artist to come back and then go back to the committee and present and sort of have a sort of almost evaluation, feedback of what it's like to be a war artist. And he really said, you need to have more than one go over, because it's just such a lonely thing. You know, even the press that are there, the journalists, there's a group of them. They can share experiences, stories. If as a war artist, you're lonely, and no one really gets. You know, you might get some people who are interested in retrieve what you're doing, but a lot of people will be, you know, particularly people in the army, but even the journalists could be a bit cynical about what you're doing. And of course, you've got that, they have that connection with the IWM. We used to sort of go via the MOD and they would help assist. We also worked with NGOs in Afghanistan. That's what we did when we sent Paul Seawright and Langens and Bell. So following Graham Fagan's feedback, we sent 2 sets of artists to Afghanistan, and we were trying to move away for the MOD at that point as well, because we didn't want. We're always trying to say we're not a military museum. You know, obviously that's a big part of what we do, but that's not the only side. So we're interested in working with other organisations that are in the war zone. But we haven't done this sort of thing for a while now. We're kind of reassessing how we do it, because we know from these stories that there's quite a few. It's quite problematic sending this observer into the war zone. It really has its foundations from the First World War, this idea of a war artist going out to the front line. A lot of these artists, such as Paul Nash, for example, famously, he was a soldier, he came back, he made his own artistic response, and then he was engaged by the War Artist Scheme and sent out again to make artworks for the propaganda scheme. So that's the model that throughout the 20th century we've been looking to, but it's just not fit for purpose when we're dealing with contemporary conflicts. It's not the same. But yes, with the artists that we do engage with, we have a short list, as I mentioned with Peter Howson. There were 9 artists on that short list. They chose Howson, but I think those artists were kind of, certainly with other commissions, we would get them to present their ideas, so that and they would come to the committee and they'd say, if I was chosen, this is what I'd be interested in, this is what I'd look at. And that was more the evolution as well, because the idea was the committee wouldn't be telling these artists what to do. They were selecting these artists on the basis of their previous work and thinking this would be an interesting combination. So there's been an evolution, but certainly we do keep in touch with our artists as much as possible if they're interested, because it's a momentous thing in any artist's life to do a war art commission. Yeah, and then what was the other question that was before that?
So, well, I think you've covered a lot of ground now that I've thrown so many questions at you. But somebody does ask if there are equivalent powerful artists currently commissioned to paint in Ukraine. I guess.
Yes, so we haven't got a commission currently to paint in Ukraine. So at the moment, our major commissioning project is what we call the 1418 Now Legacy Fund. So 1418 Now was a sort of a government arts project that happened during the centenary of the First World War, and they were sort of in partnership with IWM, and they did various arts projects. It was wider than sort of visual arts. There was theatre involved and things like that as well. And Jeremy Deller famously, he engaged all these people to wear the First World War uniforms and stand still in stations around the country, train stations. I forget the title of that piece now, but there were quite a few, high-profile artists like him. And crucially for us, Peter Jackson, the filmmaker, famous for the Lord of the Rings films. He wanted to work with the film archive, and he made this film, They Shall Not Grow Old, which he colorized, he cleaned it up and he colorized it. It was an amazing hit, and he agreed to share the royalties with the museum for a project to commission artists. So this is what we call, there's been a bit about press about it, but it's called the 1418 Now I think it might even be called the IWM 1418 Now Legacy Fund. And the idea is we're looking more outwards, and we're working with different organisations across the UK. So we're not just having things within the museum here. I think quite soon, Michael Rakovitz, the artist, he will be opening his show that's part of this at the Baltic Centre in Gateshead. They're working with Company XY, who is a circus company in Northern Ireland, in Derry. There's the Glenvivian Gallery in Swansea that we're working with. Heather Phillipson, the artist, is doing work there, and there's more to come as well. So I mean, it's just this incredible, huge project, which as an oversight, the IWM Art Commissions Committee is sort of overseeing this. It's so different to what we were doing before. We're dealing with higher sums of money. We never had very much to do these war zone commissions, but yeah, crucially, it's not sending British artists out into war zones. So yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment.
Amazing. So much detail about all that, really, sort of informative. I've got a couple more here. So Robert Parks says, you can see the intention of the two artists in the execution of their various styles. Were there anti-war statements to do with their choice of styles? I.e., was it deliberate, or was it just the way they felt most natural to express themselves?
Oh, so anti-war statement. I mean, you could say for Howson, for sure. I mean, he's just, he is somebody who is exploring something that he is appalled by. And I think what's fascinating is that he just continues to do it. He churns it out. How does he keep painting these paintings, which is often so difficult to look at? But yeah, it's anti-war. Yes, I'm sure it's anti-violence. But he's having to confront this because he believes that we're all capable of this. And I think his faith is a big part of how he's kind of conceptualizing this, how he's thinking about this, and what it means to be human. And he knows that he's spoken about how we have good within us too. And it's not like saying, we're all evil, we're all bad, but he just doesn't sort of shy away from that. So I think, yes, it is an anti-war statement, but he's also kind of, there's nothing you couldn't say any of his work was pro-war. I don't think anything about it glorifies war. And then with a woman artist like Laura Knight, it's a different sort of thing entirely, because it's showing an aspect of war which is away from the front line, it's away from the violence. I mean, actually what Ruby Loft is doing here is creating a part of machine which will inflict terrible violence, isn't she? So, I mean, you could easily say this work was pro-war. I mean, you could even say this work glorifies war. You could go that far. But it had a purpose at the time. We're talking about a whole country who was under total war, and there was a reason for trying to keep people unified in this. This what the government was trying to do with its visual outputs and things. But then when you look at it's a different sort of context once it's over, and once you're looking at the Nuremberg trial, that painting. And this is about a reckoning, isn't it? It's about the end of the war, and acknowledging that this terrible thing has happened, and it's still visible, but something sober and rational, judicial. The legal environment is something we can use to sort of heal and get over this. So yeah, is that anti-war or pro-war? I don't think it's either really. But yeah, I don't know. Does that help?
Okay, and I think final comment we have here is from Diane Silverthorne, who says, Stella's work, we're here because we're here,
That's
question
the
mark.
one. Yes, thank you. Yeah, we're here because we're here. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Very powerful work.
Indeed. Well, Claire, I think we've covered so much ground tonight, and I think we should let you get home now before you're locked in. And,
thank you. Thank you.
a well-deserved supper. I hope you'll come and talk with us again. It's been absolutely brilliant, and we've learned so much, apart from the artists and the paintings that you mentioned, just so much about what's happening at the Imperial War Museum, all the brilliant things you do, the sort of current commissioning process, how you look after artists and that kind of thing, which I feel we would all not have known without your intervention. So thank you for all that.
Oh, that's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so I will just ask everyone to thank Claire again for that fascinating talk. I'd also like to thank Reka behind the scenes for all her hard work. If you haven't done so, please try and catch Peter Howson's work at the gallery. The last day is this Friday. And then the Nuremberg trial studies by Laura Knight, that exhibition will open on the 25th of July. So we hope to see you all there. Please look out for further talks, which we hope will be as good as Claire's this August on benuri.org. So thank you all and good night.